Welcome everyone. So we're moving online in order to complete this class. We'll be picking up from where we left off right after the midterm, addressing really the Chicano movement, and then after that it becomes very thematic. I'll try to make the lecture short, about maybe 10-15 minutes, just depends on the lecture. Some might be a little bit longer, but they'll be in chunks. But we'll we'll try to get through the semester as successfully as we can. So last time we left off looking at Mexican Americans in the 1950s, and we're going to continue to look at the 50s, but this time we're going to look at some of the activism from this generation. So we left off looking at how Anglo-Americans begin to move to the suburbs, minorities get to more or less are left living in the urban centers. There's a lot of segregation at this time. Mexican Americans and along with other groups cannot move into the suburbs. Sometimes, in some places, it's illegal. But we're going to see that in the 1950s, Mexican Americans kind of give up on the idea of assimilation and focus more on activism and acculturation. So this is a very kind of transformative period for Mexican Americans because they try to fit in, as you saw with the article by Vicky Ruiz, where young women were, buying the makeup and watching the movies and all that type of stuff, yet they still couldn't fit in, right? So that begins to change as we go into the 50s and 60s, and you'll see that in the documentary that you'll have to watch that focuses on Chicana activism in the 1960s. So some of the activism that happens for Mexican Americans and that kind of defines this generation is through the school system. Many of them, many young kids are going to the different public schools, and they're at the bottom of this totem pole. They're doing all the kind of vocational type courses, and their parents get wind of this. So they actually do something about it. One of the most kind of significant cases that emerged during this period is Mendez versus Westminster. And as you can kind of see the year here, it predates Brown versus Board. Brown versus Board was in 1954, and that desegregated schools across the United States. Well, Mexican Americans went to court in 47 and outside of the Los Angeles area and filed this case, Mendez versus Westminster, and argue that that it's unconstitutional to segregate Mexican Americans in the educational system. And they were actually successful in this case. So this was a precursor to Brown versus Board. It is noted that Brown v. Board actually uses pieces of this case in order to justify that national case. But there's other cases, Delgado versus Bastrop in Texas. Same thing, they were segregating kids, Mexican American kids, based on race, and they went to court too. There's a particular organization named LULAC that was helping both of these cases. And again, they won because Mexican Americans were defined as Caucasians during this time. And between this, during this era, it was legal to segregate African Americans, but since Mexican Americans were not African Americans, and again, they were defined as basically white, right, as Caucasian, they thought that it was illegal to segregate them. So this is one of these instances where being classified as white kind of helped Mexican Americans. And then there's another case in San Diego where the school, almost like the entire school population, sued the school, with the exception of one student, because one student was being actually bused from this Mexican or even African American school to a white school. And they wanted to implement this separate but equal law in 1955, so Brown versus Board already happened. And they argue that, again, it was unconstitutional to segregate minority children. So here's another case where Mexican Americans won. Now, what kind of stands out in this case is that Mexican Americans, they weren't out there in the streets protesting, right? There weren't wildcat strikes or anything like that, but they were using the political system in order to bring equality to their communities. So in these particular cases, they hired lawyers, They noted that the American Constitution applies to all, and they were successful. So this kind of really defines this generation. So again, I don't want to present a history of victimization because it's not. There's, like these examples show, people did fight back. They just fought back in different ways. In this particular example, it was through the court system. Other examples where Mexican Americans fought back, one of the examples that we have is jury duty. Mexican Americans were not allowed to participate in juries. And if you probably know, in court cases, you're supposed to be judged by your peers, and Mexican Americans fought to have representation in the jury pool. So again, because Mexican Americans are perceived as Caucasian, this is another way that they kind of argued in order to participate in these very important proceedings. So this just kind of reiterates what it just said. So again, because Mexican Americans are considered white, at least during this period, it was viewed as unconstitutional to bar them from jury duty. However, even though they have those successes, there are other examples where Mexican Americans are barred from different elements of society. And you read an excerpt about Operation Wetback. In 1954, we have an economic recession, almost like 2008, and the California government created this operation to deport Mexican nationals, and it was called Operation Wetback. So agents went around and basically racially profiled Mexican Americans. So if you looked Mexican, then you were subject to a stop, question, and even arrested. So this is a lot like what happened here in Arizona in 2008 with Sheriff Joe. You probably all know, he got convicted of racial profiling, even though he was pardoned later by some president. It doesn't change the fact that he did profile, and the same thing was happening in the 1950s. And people these federal agents just went up to Mexican people, and like Sheriff Joe said, you look Mexican, therefore you must be here illegal, and they would arrest them. Now, this had a major impact in the Mexican American community because many of them were afraid, are they going to be targeted next? I've had students where they used to tell me that their uncles in the 1950s used to walk around with a birth certificate. Now, again, that's kind of odd, right? Because most of us don't walk around without a birth certificate. But this is a reality of the 1950s where people were afraid that just because of the way they look, they might be questioned. Part of this program also included Operation Terror. Again, the reading kind of talks about this, where these federal agents would just go into people's homes. They didn't use search warrants, which were illegal, and again arrested people. Well, Mexican Americans didn't just sit there idly; they fought back. So here are just some examples of the many organizations that address the unconstitutional aspect of programs such as Operation Wetback. So you have the CSO, it's a community organization. You have Civil Rights for Congress, American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, and a lot of labor unions participated in these kind of legal proceedings to stop the deportation of Mexican nationals or even Mexican Americans, because a lot of times their kids have to be sent back home too. Where else are they going to live, right? So by the 1950s, Mexican Americans become more radical. Again, it's this perception that they are born here, yet they're not able to participate in and have the same rights as any other U.S. citizen. So they begin to form organizations that address the injustices that Mexican Americans face. One of them is National Association of Mexican Americans. It's called ANMA. It actually has a Spanish name. And many of the members in ANMA happen to be part of the Independent Progressive Party, which in the late 30s and 40s was a collective group of Anglo-Americans and different ethnicities, African Americans and so forth. And many of these people kind of fought against racism. Eventually, Mexican Americans kind of branched out and formed their own organization that it's mostly composed of Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals to address issues of racism and housing discrimination, education discrimination. So this organization is formed in 48, and this organization welcomed everybody. They're very kind of left-leaning politically, and they welcome women to participate and take leadership roles. One woman that I studied, part of my dissertation work, she actually participated in ANMA, and they treated her as an equal. So this was one of the positive aspects of organizations such as ANMA. They also were part of the labor movement, so they participated in strikes, and they helped organize braceros, and I'll talk about braceros later when I mention about Cesar Chavez. Right. And they also took a broader scope when addressing some of these political issues, that it's not just what's happening in the United States, and this will be part of the Chicano movement. So we can see this kind of transition from the Mexican American generation, who were kind of focusing on politics that just impacted them here in the United States, to this Chicano generation. So the 1950s is definitely like a transition period where they begin to address, well, a lot of these things are related to American colonization, right? I mean, the United States doesn't consider itself a colonizing power, but understand that the United States in the 1950s has its tentacles all over the world. And one of these places are places like Chile, right? Or even has a major influence in places like Mexico. It is noted that when Mexico, when the United States sneezes, Mexico has a cold. And that expression just kind of shows how tied Mexico is to the American economy. Well, the United States has these, kind of supports dictators around the world, which kind of forces people to migrate and come to the United States. So we play a role when it comes to immigration issues at this time. So what do we learn? Number one, we see how in the 1950s, it's not new, but we do see political activism that's really based on their identity. So they went from the 1930s and 40s, as I taught in class before, where many groups build coalitions, right? Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, Asian-Americans, and so forth, build coalitions amongst each other to support each other. And then as the 1950s begins to come of age, Anglo-Americans begin to leave some of the blue-collar jobs, they become more professional, they move to the suburbs, and now minorities don't get the same opportunities, so they begin to build their own organizations. And this begins to develop the concept of Chicana identity, and really Chicano, I guess what would be defined as radicalism. And I don't mean radicalism in a bad way, but more Chicano activism, where they focus on things that impact their community, whereas before, the 1930s to the 1950s was focused more on economic class struggles that all groups face. The late 50s and 60s focuses more on issues that Mexican Americans face. And every group tends to do this. African Americans have their movement, hence Brown v. Board. Asian Americans have their Asian American movement, and so forth. So you're going to watch a video next that really looks like at the birth of the Chicano movement and actually digs deep into the Chicano movement. So I posted some questions. I posted a link to the video, and you can watch it and make sure to complete the questions. So some of them will show up on the final, but also you need to submit it for credit. All right. Next time we meet, we'll talk about Cesar Chavez.